The old barn groaned under the weight of history and silence. Dust floated in the shafts of late afternoon light, swirling above the dirt floor like forgotten ghosts. In the center of it all stood Dusty, a proud chestnut horse with a bold white blaze down his face, his powerful body trembling with unease. Beside him, crumpled on her knees, was Lorelai Whitmore, a girl who looked like she had fought every storm life could throw and still found herself broken. Her torn jeans and faded shirt were smeared with grime, but it was the raw desperation in her swollen, tear-streaked face that silenced the room. The crowd of weathered cowboys lining the walls shifted uncomfortably, their boots scuffing against the packed dirt. No one spoke. No one dared. Lorelai's small hands clutched Dusty's lead rope as if letting go would tear the very soul from her body. The horse, sensing her anguish, lowered his broad head and gently nudged her shoulder, his breath hot and trembling against her skin. Lorelai's whole frame shook. Her voice, when it finally broke through the heavy air, was little more than a choked whisper. "Please, he's all I have left." The words hit the crowd like a hammer, but still, no one moved. Ansel Hargrove, the seasoned auctioneer, stood frozen with his gavel suspended mid-air. He had witnessed many things in this barn, ruthless bidding wars, broken dreams bought and sold, but never a scene like this. The men before him, rough and unyielding by nature, found themselves trapped in a moment they didn't know how to handle. Boone Fletcher, an old rancher with years carved deep into his face, tightened his jaw until it quivered. Cassius Reed, barely old enough to call himself a man, fidgeted with the brim of his hat, his throat too tight to swallow. Dusty took another step closer to Lorelai, almost wrapping his massive body around her as if to shield her from the judgment pressing in from all sides. The intimacy of it cracked something open in every heart present. The barn, which had seen generations of pride and pain, now stood witness to a heartbreak too pure to ignore. Still, the rules of the auction loomed, rules that cared nothing for tears or loyalty. Lorelai raised her face, her eyes gleaming with unshed pain, and her voice, now raw and broken, tore through the silence. "He saved me," she gasped, "when no one else would." The weight of her confession fell like a stone into a deep well of unspoken sorrow, sending ripples through the gathered men. And deep in their chests, a darker question took root. What horrors had this girl faced alone, and how had a horse been her only savior? The barn remained locked in breathless silence, the echoes of Lorelai's words clinging to the worn wooden walls like a ghost that refused to leave. Ansel Hargrove lowered his gavel slowly, his hand trembling slightly. His gut told him that whatever story lay buried behind those haunted blue eyes was not something that could be brushed aside by the cold mechanics of a sale. Dusty shifted his weight, his ears twitching nervously, sensing the storm of emotions swirling around them both. Boone Fletcher coughed into his hand, the sound sharp and jarring in the oppressive stillness. Several of the men exchanged uncomfortable glances, but none stepped forward. Lorelai remained on her knees, hands still wrapped tightly around Dusty's lead, as if letting go would mean surrendering not just the horse, but a part of herself that could never be reclaimed. Her chest heaved with silent sobs she could no longer control, and the rawness of her pain seemed to seep into the very ground beneath her. Cassius Reed, who had been gripping his hat so tightly that his knuckles turned white, finally broke rank. His voice was soft, cracking under the weight of emotion. Maybe we ought to hear her out," he said, his words hanging uncertainly in the heavy air. Boone shot him a look, a warning born of years surviving a hard world, but even he couldn't deny the truth. Something about Lorelai's desperation gnawed at the hardened edges of their souls. Lorelai lifted her head slowly, as if the weight of her memories was too much to bear. Her eyes, red and swollen, flicked from face to face, searching, pleading, daring any one of them to meet her gaze without flinching. Dusty whinnied softly beside her, his breath misting in the cooling air, and that small sound seemed to grant her the strength to speak. "He found me," she said hoarsely. "The night everything ended. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her forehead against Dusty's neck, grounding herself in the only comfort she had left. The men shifted uneasily, some clearing their throats, others staring down at their boots. Ansel stepped forward, removing his hat with a slow, deliberate motion. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, was now low and cautious. "Tell us, girl," he said. "Tell us what happened." The words were gentle, but they carried a weight that pressed down on everyone present. Lorelai squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the flood of images that threatened to drown her, and when she spoke again, her voice was little more than a whisper. "It was the fire," she said, her words sending a ripple through the crowd. "The fire that took everything, and almost took me, too." The barn seemed to hold its breath once more, every ear straining toward her as the truth finally began to surface, a truth more painful than any of them could have imagined. The word fire hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Men shifted on their feet, their faces darkening with a quiet dread. Lorelai clutched Dusty tighter, burying her face against his coarse, warm neck as the memory clawed its way to the surface. Outside, the sun had dipped low enough that long shadows stretched across the barn floor, swallowing the corners in gloom. Dusty's muscles tensed beneath Lorelai's trembling hands, as if even he could remember the terror that had bound them together. "I was asleep," she rasped, lifting her head slightly. Her voice carried the brittle edge of a soul too battered to pretend anymore. "The smoke woke me first. Then the screaming." Her fingers twisted into Dusty's mane, grounding herself against the storm rising inside her. Boone's jaw tightened as he listened, his hand clenching and unclenching by his side. None of them could look away now. They were trapped in the gravity of her pain. "The house, it was already half gone when I made it to the front door," Lorelai continued, her eyes staring at something far beyond the walls of the barn. "I don't even know how he got there. Dusty. I should have been trapped, burned with everything else. But there he was, outside the fence, kicking, screaming, refusing to leave without me." Her voice broke, and for a moment, only the creak of the barn's rafters filled the silence. Cassius wiped a hand across his mouth, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs. Waylon Pike, one of the older ranchers who had remained silent until now, tipped his hat back and whispered, "Animals got a sense for things like that, something most folks forget." His words, though soft, carried a heavy truth that settled over the men like a blanket too heavy to lift. Dusty shifted closer to Lorelai, his wide, sorrowful eyes sweeping the crowd as if daring anyone to deny the bond they shared. "I ran," Lorelai whispered. "I don't remember how. Just his voice in my head, pulling me forward. Dusty led me away from the house, away from the fire, away from the screams." Her throat closed on the last word, and she shook her head fiercely, fighting tears she could no longer afford. The fire hadn't just taken her family, her home. It had stolen her childhood, her safety, everything she thought she understood about the world. Ansel Hargrove placed his hat over his heart, a deep furrow etched into his brow. Around him, the others stood rooted in place, powerless against the raw truth laid bare before them. But in the shadows at the edge of the barn, a figure watched with narrowed eyes, a man who saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. The low murmur of unease spread through the barn like a slow-moving wildfire. Lorelai's story had settled over the men like a heavy fog, clouding judgment, softening even the hardest hearts. Yet in the far corner, half hidden by shadows, Clive Randolph stood with arms crossed, a slight smirk twisting his lips. His eyes, cold and calculating, stayed locked on Dusty and Lorelai. Where others saw heartbreak, he saw a prize, one he intended to claim, no matter the cost. Ansel Hargrove cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably on the auctioneer's stand. The rules were clear. Sympathy, no matter how powerful, couldn't stop the gears of business. But something inside him, something he hadn't felt in decades, urged him to hesitate. Dusty wasn't just a horse up for bid. He was a lifeline, a living memory, a last tether to a life that had already burned to ash. Ansel glanced at Boone, whose clenched jaw and lowered eyes spoke louder than words. This wasn't just another sale. Clive took a slow step forward, the creak of his boots on the old wood slicing through the heavy silence. He tipped his hat back and spoke in a voice sharp as broken glass. "Seems to me," he drawled, "this horse needs a proper owner. One who can pay." His eyes gleamed with something cruel as he let the words hang in the air. Lorelai flinched, shrinking back against Dusty's side, her hand fisting into the horse's mane as if she could will herself invisible. Boone stepped forward instinctively, the old instinct to protect Roaring to life. "Ain't nobody said the girl was out of the running yet," he growled, his voice low but dangerous. The tension in the barn tightened like a drawn rope. Men exchanged glances, some cautious, some daring, but none willing to be the first to challenge Clive openly. Dusty shifted uneasily beneath Lorelai's touch, his ears flicking back, his body trembling as if he sensed the coming storm. Lorelai lifted her head slowly, her eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. "I'll find a way," she said hoarsely. "I'll pay, somehow." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. For a moment, the girl who had seemed so broken now stood taller, held up by sheer willpower and the unwavering loyalty of the animal beside her. Clive chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Hope and promises don't buy horses, sweetheart," he sneered. And as Ansel hesitated, hammer still in hand, everyone in that barn realized the same chilling truth. The fight for Dusty had only just begun, and not everyone was willing to play fair. Ansel's fingers hovered over the gavel, heart pounding louder than the murmurs that rippled through the barn. Never in all his years had he felt such weight in a simple decision. Dusty stood tense, muscles quivering beneath Lorelai's desperate grip. Across the arena, Clive Randolph adjusted his belt with a smug tilt of his head, fully confident that money would do what mercy would not, tip the balance in his favor. "I'll start the bid," Clive called out, his voice slicing through the tension. $500. A few gasps echoed in the crowd. It was a high starting point for a horse no one had dared to claim. Until now. Lorelai's body jerked as if she'd been struck. She had nothing. Not even a fraction of that amount. Her breath hitched, and she instinctively stepped closer to Dusty, shielding him with her own small frame, as if she could somehow make herself a wall between him and the world. Boone Fletcher's jaw tightened. He took a half-step forward, then stopped himself. His ranch was barely staying afloat. Bidding against Clive could ruin him. Around him, others stood frozen, torn between sympathy and the cold reality of survival. Ansel's hand trembled visibly now. In his mind, he saw Lorelai's tear-streaked face every time he tried to bring the gavel down. Every instinct screamed that selling Dusty would be wrong, but business, cold and brutal, didn't care for broken hearts. Lorelai's voice cracked painfully. She swallowed hard, willing her shattered pride down. "I'll work. I'll do anything. Please, just don't take him." Her voice was small, but in that moment it carried more weight than any bid could. She looked at every man in the room, daring someone, anyone, to remember what it meant to fight for something more important than money. Dusty pressed his broad head into her back, as if lending her strength she barely had left. Clive laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed cruelly through the barn. "Work won't pay a debt, girl. You either have the cash, or you don't." His words were like a slap in the face, and Lorelai recoiled as if physically struck. Boone cursed under his breath, looking around desperately, but the crowd remained silent, weighed down by their own helplessness. Just as Ansel lifted the gavel again, ready to end it, a voice rose from the far end of the barn. Steady, calm, and unexpected. "I'll cover her bid," the voice said. And every head turned sharply toward the shadowed figure stepping forward, a man no one had seen coming. For a moment, no one moved. The barn seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were stunned by the interruption. Lorelai twisted around, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. Dusty snorted softly behind her, sensing the shift in the air. From the shadows near the entrance, the figure stepped into the light, a tall, broad-shouldered man with deep-set eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a worn hat. His clothes were plain, dusty from the road, but his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who meant every word. "I'll cover her bid," he repeated, louder this time. His gaze never wavered, locking directly onto Ansel Hargrove, daring him to deny the offer. The cowboys standing nearest to the stranger stepped back instinctively, sensing the tension crackling like static between him and Clive Randolph. Boone narrowed his eyes, trying to place the newcomer's face, but there was something unfamiliar about him, something unsettling in the way he carried himself. Clive's face darkened, a flush of anger climbing up his neck. "This ain't charity work," he spat. "She can't just have the horse because someone feels sorry for her." His voice rang out sharp and ugly in the heavy stillness. But the stranger didn't flinch. He took another step closer, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Clive's face. Dusty whinnied low, tossing his head, picking up on the rising tension between the men. Ansel hesitated, the gavel poised in his hand. His gut twisted painfully. This wasn't how auctions were supposed to go. But nothing about this day had followed the rules. He cleared his throat, voice rough. "You willing to match the bid? $500? He asked, even though he already knew the answer. The stranger nodded once, slow and deliberate, then reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a thick roll of bills, peeling them off without hesitation. Lorelai watched in stunned silence, tears welling up in her eyes for the 100th time that day. She didn't know this man, didn't know why he was doing this, but the weight of gratitude crushed her chest. Dusty bumped her shoulder gently, as if to remind her he was still there, still hers, if only fate would allow it. Boone leaned toward Cassius, murmuring under his breath, "Ain't nobody that generous without a reason." His words sent a ripple of suspicion through the crowd. As Ansel accepted the stranger's payment, the barn buzzed with quiet whispers. Who was this man? What did he want? And as Lorelai met the stranger's steady gaze, a cold shiver crept down her spine, a feeling that the true cost of Dusty's salvation was yet to be revealed. The heavy sound of Ansel's gavel hitting the block echoed through the barn, sealing Dusty's fate. A murmur swept through the crowd as the stranger slipped the rest of his cash back into his coat, his movements calm, almost practiced. Lorelai's heart pounded in her ears, torn between overwhelming relief and a rising tide of fear she couldn't name. Dusty nudged her side again, his large, soulful eyes flickering between her and the man who had just bought his freedom. Ansel cleared his throat, trying to reclaim some control of the situation. "Horse is sold," he announced, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. "To, Mr.?" He let the question hang in the air. The stranger tilted his head slightly, his mouth twisting into a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can call me Sawyer," he said simply. No last name, no explanation. Just Sawyer, and an unsettling stillness that made Boone Fletcher shift uneasily on his feet. Lorelai struggled to her feet, her legs trembling with exhaustion and nerves. Dusty stayed close, his massive frame almost shielding her from the stares she felt burning into her back. She wanted to run, to disappear into the fading light of the evening, but something rooted her in place. When Sawyer approached, he moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had learned not to fear much of anything. He stopped a few feet away, tipping his hat back just enough to meet her gaze. "You'll work off the debt," Sawyer said, his voice low, meant only for her ears. There was no malice in it, not yet, but no kindness either. "Fair trade, wouldn't you say?" Lorelai swallowed hard, a knot forming in her stomach. She nodded stiffly, though every instinct inside her screamed to be wary. She owed him now, and debts in this world were rarely clean, rarely simple. Boone watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, his gut twisting with unease. Lorelai was too vulnerable, too desperate to see the danger coiling around her. Cassius leaned close and muttered, "That man's hiding something." Boone didn't answer. He didn't have to. The whole barn could feel it, the shift in the air, like the stillness before a thunderstorm ripped the sky apart. As Sawyer led Lorelai and Dusty toward the exit, whispers followed them like shadows. And somewhere deep in Lorelai's chest, a voice she tried to ignore whispered the warning she wasn't ready to hear. Freedom always comes with a price, and hers had just been set. The last light of evening clung stubbornly to the horizon as Lorelai followed Sawyer across the dusty lot behind the barn. Dusty's hooves clopped quietly beside her, the only steady sound in a world that suddenly felt unsteady and strange. She clutched the lead rope tighter, her fingers aching, her mind spinning. Gratitude warred with suspicion inside her, each step heavier than the last. Sawyer didn't speak. He didn't offer comfort or explanation. He simply led her toward the unknown, as if her fate had already been decided the moment she knelt on that barn floor. At the back of the lot sat an old pickup truck hitched to a battered two-horse trailer. It looked functional but worn, like everything about Sawyer. He opened the trailer door without a word, and Lorelai coaxed Dusty up the ramp. The horse hesitated, tossing his head nervously, but eventually obeyed, trusting her more than the man who now owned both of their futures. As she latched the trailer, she caught Sawyer watching her, not with cruelty, but with a heavy expectation that made her skin prickle. "You'll ride up front with me," Sawyer said, his voice breaking the stillness. "We got a long way to go." Lorelai's stomach twisted. She didn't even know where "go" was. Part of her wanted to refuse, to run, but reality crashed down around her like a wave. She had no home, no family, no money. Dusty needed her, and she had made a promise she couldn't break, no matter how uncertain the road ahead looked. The drive started in silence. The old truck rumbled and rattled down the darkening country roads, headlights cutting narrow paths through the creeping mist. Lorelai stared out the window, watching the fields blur by, her mind too numb to form clear thoughts. Sawyer kept his eyes on the road, his face unreadable. Minutes stretched into miles, and the weight of unspoken questions grew between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, as they crossed a narrow bridge, Sawyer spoke, his voice low and steady. "I don't take charity," he said. "And I don't give it either. You'll work for your keep, hard work. You understand?" Lorelai nodded stiffly, her throat too tight to form words. She didn't know what kind of labor he meant. She only knew she had little choice now. Dusty's soft snort from the trailer behind them was the only comfort she had left. As the truck disappeared deeper into the night, Lorelai tightened her fists in her lap, a cold certainty settling into her bones. Whatever lay ahead, it would cost her more than she had ever imagined, and Sawyer wasn't a man to forgive debts easily. The night stretched long and merciless around them. The truck's old engine groaned as Sawyer pulled off the main road onto a narrow gravel path that twisted between the trees. The headlights caught glimpses of rusted fences and sagging barns before they were swallowed again by the darkness. Lorelai sat stiffly in the passenger seat, every bump in the road jarring her already frayed nerves. Dusty's faint shifting noises from the trailer behind them were the only thread keeping her grounded. After what felt like an eternity, Sawyer finally stopped in front of a dilapidated ranch house. Its windows were dark, and the porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Lorelai's heart sank. She had imagined hardship, had prepared herself for it, but something about this place felt heavier, more broken than she had expected. Sawyer killed the engine and sat in silence for a moment, staring at the house as if gathering his own courage. "You'll sleep in the loft above the stable," he said flatly. "Ain't much, but it's dry." His tone left no room for negotiation. Lorelai nodded, biting back the questions burning her throat. She followed him around to the trailer, her hands trembling as she unlatched the ramp and coaxed Dusty out into the cool night air. The horse whinnied softly, pressing close to her side, sensing the tension humming between them and their new reality. The stable was a long, low building leaning precariously to one side. Inside, it smelled of old hay and damp wood, but at least it was shelter. Lorelai led Dusty into an empty stall, brushing down his dusty coat with slow, trembling strokes. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. "We'll figure it out. Somehow." Dusty nickered softly, nuzzling her shoulder, as if trying to reassure her when she couldn't even reassure herself. Up in the loft, the floorboards groaned under Lorelai's weight as she laid down on a pile of scratchy blankets Sawyer had tossed her without a word. The open cracks in the roof revealed a sky thick with stars, cold, distant, and indifferent. She curled up tightly, wrapping her arms around herself, feeling every bruise the day had left on her body and heart. Sleep teased the edges of her mind but never truly came. Down below, in the shadows of the stable, Sawyer leaned against a post, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the loft above. His face was carved with something harder than stone, something that spoke of debts unpaid, promises broken, and a reckoning yet to come. Morning broke cold and gray over the sagging ranch. The first light crept into the stable, painting everything in shades of silver and sorrow. Lorelai stirred on her makeshift bed, her body stiff from the hard floor and the weight of too many worries. Dusty's soft whinny from below pulled her fully awake. She sat up slowly, wrapping her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, steeling herself for whatever work Sawyer had in store. Downstairs, Sawyer waited, a steaming mug of coffee in one hand, his face as unreadable as the night before. Without a word, he pointed to a broken fence in the distance, boards leaning and scattered. Lorelai understood immediately. There would be no easy days here. Only work, sweat, and survival. She nodded once and moved to fetch the tools, Dusty following her steps with quiet loyalty from his stall. Every nail hammered, every board lifted, was a silent promise to herself. She would endure. She had to. As the sun climbed higher, Sawyer's voice finally broke the heavy silence between them. "Why him?" he asked, nodding toward Dusty. His voice lacked mockery. It was a genuine question. Lorelai paused, wiping sweat from her forehead, and turned to face him fully. "Because when everything was burning, when everyone else ran, he stayed," she said simply. The words hung between them, heavier than any burden she carried. Sawyer studied her for a long moment, the lines around his mouth deepening. Then, without warning, he tossed a set of worn keys at her feet. Lorelai stared at them, confused. "You paid your debt," he said gruffly. "And more." She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Go," he added, jerking his chin toward the horizon beyond the broken fences. "Take the horse. Start over. Don't waste it." Tears blurred her vision as she bent to pick up the keys with trembling fingers. She hadn't realized how deeply hope had been buried inside her, until now, when it clawed its way free. She led Dusty out of the stable, the morning sun warming their backs as they walked toward the road. She didn't know where she was going. It didn't matter. They were free, and that was enough. As Lorelai climbed into the old truck and Dusty loaded obediently into the trailer behind her, she glanced back one last time. Sawyer stood in the doorway, watching them with a look that was almost regret. Without a word, she drove away, leaving behind the ashes of her past and carrying with her the quiet, unbreakable bond of survival and love. If this story touched your heart like it touched ours, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. We have many more stories of hope, survival, and second chances waiting for you.